Now, this is quite a common challenge that many relationships face: drift, especially when you've been in the relationship for quite some time, or perhaps you experience the challenge of new family additions or life stage changes. But I mean, do all marriages experience this drift? Or does it mean, that something's wrong or that we're incompatible if it does happen?
Yeah, it's a good observation that many people actually make. They say, yeah, we're incompatible, or we don't feel the same, or our feelings have faded. Where in reality, when people feel that way, they've probably experienced marriage drift. Now, just a bit of a recap on what we discussed last week. Marriage drift is something that occurs in probably most marriages. I think very few marriages don't experience that, and marriage drift isn't necessarily a sign that your marriage is, proverbially heading to the rocks. It just means that we need to do some work, regain our focus, and put some energy into swimming in the right direction. We used this analogy last week for some of our listeners that maybe missed that, around when you're swimming at the beach and you've got the flag poles that say, you need to swim between these zones. If you're not paying attention to those zones, you can easily get carried away by the tide and experience drift, right, and find yourself in a sticky situation. So many marriages do experience drift, but the good news, the hope in this, is that it's not actually that difficult to regain focus. It's all about understanding the original purpose and the mission, and maybe rekindling those first thoughts we had when we initially got together.
So looking at understanding, our mission in marriage, getting together, when I think about marriage drift, can I just ask, is it perhaps something that you may experience seasonally within your marriage? And that when you do that, how can we identify and maybe get a reflection or a measure of perhaps where we're at in terms of drift in our marriage?
Yeah, that's good. I think back on, a term that I hear quite often. It's used in the business world as well as the non-for-profit space where we function, is the term mission drift, and many companies go through and organizations go through what they call mission drift. That's when, for example, something that might be good takes over from that main mission, that original intent. And let's take in marriage, for example, raising kids. Raising kids is often, for those marriages, for those people that do have children, appreciate there are some people that might not, be in that journey in their marriage. So bear with me for a moment if that's you. But, for those people that, for example, have children in their marriage, that's a good thing, being parents to children. But that good thing can often distract from the first thing, the main thing, which is your marriage, which is, children should be an offspring of marriage, which it is. But when parenting takes over and the marriage takes second foot, that marriage might be in trouble, very soon.
What would that look like, for example, like practically, for example, if you're someone who maybe doesn't realize that your children have started to take, priority over your spouse, what would that look like in terms of, days, hours, time, etc.?
Yeah, exactly that. Days, hours, and time where you feel like, your spouse is, probably just, your roommates. You get frustrated with one another more often than you're actually enjoying one another. Your responsibilities tend to take over, and often the fun or the joy is a bit lacking in the relationship. There's some easy remedies to actually fix that. I'm reminded actually about, when I first met Al Ray, my wife. I'd mentioned to her, that I actually I like her and I want to get to know her and better in that sense. And when I had that conversation, I almost felt like in the moment, for me personally, the journey was, God almost encouraging me to not enter into a relationship if I'm not doing it with the sole intention of expressing His love or being an expression of His love in this relationship. just my journey as a Christian, where I was at then, actually put me to a place where I firmly believe marriage is that reflection of God's love, for his bride. And so I almost felt in that sense, God was nudging me. If I'm not going into this relationship with that intention, then I just shouldn't waste time and do it. And so that to me was almost like a call to action. Is like, okay, Wynand, you've got a bigger mission in this relationship. This is not about getting your needs fulfilled. This is about actually, being an expression of God's love towards this person, And it's interesting, but I've had to recently actually give myself an honest look in the mirror and say, look, have I experienced mission drift? Am I still expressing the love of God in our relationship the way I was encouraged to do when we first met? And, there have been days that I would honestly say no. But that's where it starts. It's like, can we have an honest look in the mirror, an honest conversation with ourselves and say, hey, hang on a minute. There's an original mission that we signed up for when we got married. There was an original excitement we had before the responsibilities of life took over, before we started becoming comfortable and, maybe even complacent with one another. And how can I just revisit that original vision, that original, story when we first met?
I guess it's a case of honest reflections also leading to honest conversations, isn't it? To be able to review these things.
Exactly. And, if you're sort of wondering, where you're at in your marriage, and this is tracking back to what you asked before, Tom, is if you can have that honest conversation and say, look, have we drifted? Have I drifted? And it's not like a negative diagnosis. It's just an observation. It's just realizing, hey, hang on a minute. I know what the original mission was. I know what marriage was supposed to be, and I know why we got married in the first place. I just haven't experienced much of that lately. So, once we can identify that, look ourselves in the mirror and, simple question to ask yourself, on a scale of 0 to 10, how would I rate our marriage right now? And I would say if it's anything lower than a 7, there's definitely work to do there. Well, even if it's a 7, you can ask yourself the follow-up question, what do I need to do to take it to an 8 or a 9? It's like there's always room for growth. But here's a funny story that Dave and Ann Wilson, they are the podcast hosts for the Family Life Today show in America, and they also wrote the book Vertical Marriage, which is a great read. We'll do some work on that later this year as well. But at some stage in their marriage journey, they tell the story about how they asked that question, and I think every year at the anniversary they were asked, how would you rate our marriage right now? And Dave was like a 9 out of 10, and Anne said, maybe a 1. So
okay.
I guess you have to be prepared for the answer, right? If you're going to ask that question.
Exactly, but also be prepared that you might be completely blindsided. You might not have any clue what is really going on. But that's a great place for us starting that conversation is, we had this mission, we had this excitement when we got married. How would you rate us on that journey? And next week, I'd love for us to talk a bit about this idea of how do we dream again when we've potentially experienced relationship drift. And it might be that you think your relationship is a 1 out of 10 right now, or maybe it's a 6 out of 10 and you really want it to be a 7, or maybe it's a 9 but you want it to be a 10. So if we can dream again and bring what has drifted back on track, we can enjoy all the benefits that God originally planned for marriage.